Okay, well, I know we have a few more people trying to get into the room, but we'll get started. Welcome everyone to Drexel University's Global Education Colloquium. My name is Christy Kelly and I'm a faculty member here. I'm just so excited to see so many people registered from all over the world. And from so many different disciplines that are cross-cutting with gender and motherhood and kind of education issues around the world. We're excited today to have Gabrielle Oliveira here to give her talk. And we've been, for those of you who are students at Drexel, we just finished reading her book, so we're looking forward to a really engaging conversation afterwards. So Gabrielle is an assistant professor of Foundations of Education at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development at Boston College. Her research focuses on immigration and on mobility, on how people move, adapt, and parent across borders. Her expertise includes gender anthropology, transnationalism in Latin America. She merges the fields of anthropology and education through ethnographic work in multiple countries. She also studies the educational trajectories of immigrant and first and second generation children. She received her bachelor's degree in her native Brazil and earned her master's and doctorate degrees from Teachers College at Columbia University. She was, while at Columbia, she was a National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation Dissertation Fellow. She recently published her book, Motherhood Across Borders, woohoo, yay, Immigrants and Their Children in Mexico and New York, and is published by NYU Press in 2018. It's a fabulous read. If you get a chance to read it, please, please, please read it. It's a great book. Her book is so good that it's actually won several awards already, including the inaugural Outstanding Book Award in Ethnography at the Penn Ethnography Forum. She was also a 2018 Concha Delgado Gaitan, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, a Presidential Fellow awarded by the Council of Anthropology and Education. In addition to her academic credentials, she's also the co-founder of the group Colectiva Infancias, a Latin America group of women scholars who study migration of children across Americas. The group was recently awarded a grant by the National Geographic Foundation to assemble an online mosaic of migrant children's experiences. Dr. Oliveira lives in Massachusetts with her husband and 2 children. We're very excited for her to share her research today and hear more about where her work is going from here. So for those of you new to the colloquium, welcome. We have about an hour to hear the talk and engage in conversation. If you have questions or thoughts throughout, please just chat them in the chat box or save them for the end. We'll have plenty of time to talk. Gabrielle, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly, for having me here, for everybody who's involved in the brilliant organization of this colloquium. I was just saying how this is such a bright spot in the middle of craziness that we're all living in right now between pandemic and elections and, all the kinds of stressors that we're all encountering. So I want to be really mindful about that, and also very grateful that you took time from your day to be here when I know for a fact you have a million things in your to-do list to do, because mine just grows. I can hardly cross something out. It's just adding. And then sometimes I feel like I do something that wasn't even on the list. So I'm like, does that even count, right? So I really appreciate you being here. I'm gonna try to talk for about, hopefully 30 minutes or to max 35 minutes. I hope I don't make empty promises. And then to talk a little bit about, the book, Motherhood Across Borders, and hopefully I'll show you a glimpse into the newer projects that I'm working on to kind of show you how my research has evolved within the years and thinking through some of the issues that have also developed regarding family separation, in the United States, right? So I don't know, for those of you who follow the news, it's hard to follow the news these days, so no judgment here. But, there's just a breaking news yesterday about, the 545 children whose the Department of Homeland Security is basically saying that they can't find the parents, right? And they're saying we basically lost the information. So I always tell my students that, my Amazon packages always arrive on time and are heavily scanned. But, children, Black and brown children, for one reason or another that we know really why, the parents are nowhere to be found. So some of these issues that for me are very, very important to keep thinking about, and hopefully do important research and advocacy work that helps, right? So then we're not just talking into the academic abyss, but kind of thinking through these issues more broadly. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Kelly, for inviting me, for trusting me with this 1 hour. I hope I don't disappoint, but if I do already, I'm sorry. So I will share my screen here with you guys. And again, I'm just gonna, I really talked to my husband here about no children, no screaming, no crying, no asking for anything. I have a 6 and a 3-year-old. So if something happens, just bear with me. We're gonna keep going. That's what I tell my students. We're gonna be okay. So I'll start by talking about the book, Motherhood Across Borders. And, for those of you, I saw some introductions on the chat, and a lot of you are PhD students or, are en route to getting your PhDs. Congratulations for taking that, difficult journey. It's an important one. And this book really came from my dissertation. So, there's light in the end of the tunnel for those of you who need some extra motivation. So this book emerged from, a multitude of factors that contributed to my interest in the topic. Because when I was doing my master's degree at Columbia University, I was doing international affairs, actually, because I thought I was going to work for the UN. I had other dreams, 10, 12 years ago. And I went to Mexico to do some work with microfinance. And what I found was a lot of the towns that I visited in Mexico, the older folks there referred as ghost towns. And they referred as ghost towns because they discussed folks who were in reproductive age, right? So mothers and fathers were not there, but you could see younger children and grandparents. So I was interested in then trying to think about, okay, so where are the parents, right? And what is the relationship between the parents who are not here and the kids who are here being raised by the grandparents? So my idea was really to think through the framework of here and there. So in this one, you can take a guess which one is the here and which one is the there, right? So try to think about what happens when families, when specifically in this case, I was interested in when women migrate. So whenever I do these presentations, sometimes one of the first questions I get is, where are the fathers, right? Why do you not speak about the fathers as much as you do about the mothers? And I say, well, for most of the time when this research, it was established, right, in terms of the Mexico-US migration, it was very, very much, it was very gendered in the sense that it was stories about men, because men were the one that were migrating the most. And nobody ever asked those folks, why are you not talking about the women? But for some reason, when I talk about the women, I get some questions about, where the fathers are, which I think are fair and important, but just something to think about, that once you're looking at an issue, you have to also choose the framework you're going to look at that particular issue. And for me, was really the gendered piece of motherhood, right, as being a shaping form. So I started to think through this idea of family separation, but really through the lens of constellations, right? So, when I chose the title for the book, my editor at NYU Press actually didn't let me go with the title that I wanted because it had constellations in it. And she said, well, people may think it's about physics and we don't know if it's gonna, go. But the idea is that I started thinking about constellations because when you look at the sky and you see the stars, right, you don't see all of the stars. You group them into constellations because that's really as far as your eyes can identify things, right? So it's the same thing about family, that who, for us to choose and make decisions about who counts as a family, I think it's an artificial mindset or a setup. So for me, it was more important to think about who's involved in the everyday care of children. And in the everyday care was really this constellation, right, of people who were involved in the everyday care. So that's the reason I started thinking with this framework. So the transnational care constellation that I call is really, the mother being in the middle, and then you have the caregiver in Mexico, the children in Mexico, the US born children, right, and the children who were brought to the United States. So the women and the families that I worked with, they were all undocumented Mexican women who left Mexico and went to New York City, and they crossed the border, all of them, and they can't really go back to Mexico because of their undocumented status. If they do go back, then they're going to have to cross again, which is costly, dangerous. You know, for a lot of you, you may be familiar with some of these situations. So the mother, you know, this idea, you know, of the mother migrating from with the idea of a sacrifice for the better, for a better life for the children who were in Mexico. But some of them were able to bring one or more children with them. And then all of the women in my research had children who were born in the United States. So there's definitely an issue with the language that is used, right, to talk about children left behind, brought over. And there's great, you know, scholars who talk about how problematic that is and how it sounds like you're talking about luggage when it's actually, you know, children and families who are involved. So that's something that even though it's important to speak to the literature, it's also very important to problematize it and be very aware about how damaging that could potentially be. So the framework that I use to understand this particular issue, right? So when mothers migrate and they have these different sets of children that they're taking care of. So I really, as an anthropologist, right, I was trained in a program of anthropology and education. I was very interested in this idea of first the gender piece, which is obvious because it's the relationship, you know, women's studies is not equivalent to gender studies, but it's the idea that you're looking at the role of women in relationship to the role of men or care or how these moving pieces work, right? But also the anthropology and sociology of childhood. How is childhood constructed, right? What does it mean to be a child in Mexico or in the United States or in the different towns in Mexico where I did my research? So looking at those differences as well. And then anthropology and sociology of immigration and education, which, you know, the sociology of immigration and education has been dominated by the assimilation discourse, right? That once you migrate, you can have an upward or a downward assimilation, or it depends on how you're socialized and the education that you have. And while those are very important and helpful concepts, I try to write in a way that would push against these linear thinkings about, you know, what happens to people once they migrate. Because my life, your life, right? We don't experience linear lives. So why should immigrants in that sense as well? So kind of trying to think through the nuanced lived experiences of children, mothers, and caregivers. So the questions that you know informed my study first was this idea of how does maternal migration influence the education experiences and social trajectories of children in Mexico and in the United States. So I wanted to think about maternal migration, you know, for some of the reasons I talked to you about already, this idea that for the longest time, there was this very much, you know, that the historical migration of the braceros, right, Mexican workers into the United States, or even, you know, 19th century when we're thinking about folks who were coming from Mexico to do other work, or, you know, as far as back as the war, you know, the Spanish War, and trying to think about what territory means and how men have been portrayed in terms of the breadwinner, or, you know, this kind of stoic warrior, right, to support, and the women kind of being portrayed more as this like self-sacrificing martyr that is there to provide for their children. So I was interested in that symbolism as well, to think about that piece. And then what does it look like in practice, and how are children's education experiences shaped by these care arrangements, right? About who's taking care of them every day. So this is an example for you about what a constellation would look like, right? So you have the mother in the middle who had been in the United States for, you know, 11 years. Maria Fernanda is this example, right? She has a daughter, Florencia, who at the time was 17. She was an undocumented youth, and she was doing her GED while she was pregnant. And then you have Mariana and Rosa, who were younger, who were born in the United States and going to elementary school. And then she had Joaquin, who had stayed behind in Mexico, just starting college, was a new father, and then who was taken care of by her mother, Cecilia, right? So this is kind of what one constellation looks like. And I did the work with 20 constellations, and then I really focused on 12, right, for another layered study, and then really spend more time with 8. So that's what I call like kind of a different levels of engagement, right? Because you can do different levels of engagement in your research. You don't have to pull your hair out and try to keep the exact same level of engagement with everybody, but it's important to be very transparent about what kind of data you got from where. So I started then to think through this concept of care and education as being the currency of love, right? And this idea that immigration as a field of study is so shaped by also studies on remittances, right? Which is the money that you sent home. So Mexico's GDP is, a fifth is composed by remittances. So you have this kind of these relationships that have been established back and forth. But then I wanted to do a play in words and take on the economist's take on currency, but to kind of think about that education migrating in the name of providing a better education becomes a way that mothers showed love, right, and showed care, and how powerful that became for children who were in Mexico and who were also here, and also for the caregivers. So these are just more details about the ethnography that I'm happy to talk to folks who are interested in more methodological pieces, but I won't spend too long here. But just so you have an idea about, right, it was a 3-year transnational multi-sided ethnographic design, which means that I was in multiple places in Mexico and in different states in Mexico. But in New York, I was in different neighborhoods, right? So I was in Sunset Park, for those of you who know New York, so that's in Brooklyn, and then Jackson Heights, and then East Harlem, so and the South Bronx, so different places, but it was all in New York City. So the key findings that the book is organized around, and that the book is organized, in chapters around this, the key findings. So the first one is this idea of the ideals of care and motherhood that are assembled by women. So as I talked to you a little bit, I was very interested in the symbolism of the women, especially, I'm Brazilian myself, and there is, since I'm an anthropologist, I'm not big in generalizing. So I wouldn't say that there's a homogeneous culture in Latin America that, honors one or the other, but we all have our versions of the Virgin, right? So we have Virgin Maria in Brazil, but in Mexico, there's the Virgen of Guadalupe, right? And then there are many different characters that are mythical or not, right? That kind of compose the idea of what a woman is. And sometimes womanhood is equated with motherhood, right? And we know that they're not, that they, you don't need to be one to be another and vice versa. But sometimes these terms are conflated, and that really informs the expectations that a whole society has of women, right? About what they should be doing. So with that, so that first chapter, I really thought about that, kind of the role of women in care and what happens when you become a transnational mother, that the idea of proximity of care gets rethought, right? So if you're no longer there in person, what does that mean for what people think about you as a good, quote unquote, mother, right? Which is a lot what the women discussed in the interviews I had with them. Being a good mother means this, means providing a good education, means sacrificing for the betterment of education of my children. So that trip, that movement, that mobility, right? That very dislocation of moving from point A to point B is for the betterment of their children. However, their children on the other side get stuck into this kind of thought of being like, okay, I am the beneficiary of my mom leaving, but I never asked her to leave. So, they're kind of in this kind of precarious situation about trying to think through what, how do I reconcile the love and care that my mother has for me? And the second piece then talks about this idea that mothers and caregivers were central decision makers in schooling here and there. And, I have a lot of really interesting data that talks about how the mothers in the US are actually calling principals in Mexico and making sure that their children are well taken care of and are being fairly treated. So this love and care knows, no bounds, and it transcends these territorial notions of the nation state in the name of love and care. And then, the kids trying to kind of making sense of being away from their families, and they actively try to construct what their families are. And a lot of their thoughts are built around ideas of belonging and inequality, right? So you have the assumptions around what is Mexico and what is the US, or what's, on the other side of the border, or El Norte, right, for the folks who are in Mexico. So a lot of these assumptions that sometimes are very stereotypical, but they're also very important in the imaginaries that children are building. And then separated siblings, how I compare their educational trajectories, kind of looking at what happens with the children who are going to school in the US and the children who are in Mexico. And there's this kind of idea that perhaps the children who are in the US and living the quote unquote American dream are better off than the children who are in Mexico. And I found that not to be the complete truth, right? This idea that a lot of the children who are going to school in the US are going to underfunded, overcrowded schools and that are very low resource, that the parents don't feel empowered to go to school events or go to parent teacher conferences because of imposed language barriers, because of lack of having a translator there, because of fearing for their undocumented status. So all these barriers that also contribute to the experiences of children in the US. And then finally, the gendered education experiences that I found that girls in Mexico had this discourse that they were going to educate, they were getting an education and doing well in school for their mothers. They wanted to honor that idea, that they grew up thinking about, right? So so one of the, the things that I try to think about, so this idea of, and I'll just zoom in this one chapter, right, of mothers and caregivers are central decision makers in school related issues. And it was interesting to think about, transnational participation. Sorry, I don't know where I went. This is what happens when you want to animate your slides. You don't know where the arrows are going to finish. So kind of thinking through the transnational participation and what I mentioned before, right? How they mobilize their funds of knowledge, their cultural capital, social capital, the mothers in New York to influence education in Mexico. But at the same time, the caregivers in Mexico, they feel very similar to the mothers in New York in the sense that they, in a lot of the interviews, they talked about that they didn't have a formal education. So they themselves felt excluded from participating in the education of their grandchildren in Mexico. In the same way that mothers in New York City said that they felt excluded about participating in the education of their offspring in the United States. So in this particular chapter, I try to write as a mirrored experience to kind of almost in a split screen quality, right? That you can go back and forth and see how these experiences, they feed off each other and they're much closer than, again, boundaries and borders will make us believe. So that was something that for me was very crucial to also try to debunk myths about how, Latinx parents or Latin American families or immigrant families are not participating in school related activities in the US because they don't care about education. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that from teachers and principals. And we know that that's not true. That the fact that you took this trip, right, this journey, that this sacrifice was part of your lived experience in order to provide a better life, that if that's not care, I don't know what is, right? So that's kind of trying to also think through those lenses. This is an example of children thinking through inequality across borders, right? So one of the findings in this idea that I talked to you a little bit about, this idea of in the United States, so in this drawing, the child is saying, I imagine it being, a place with a lot of opportunities, technology, but with pollution, right? So I found it interesting that there were many windows into really an inequality and a neoliberal analysis of what a developed society is that comes with opportunities but pollution, right? And I think that is so savvy from children to be able to assemble this and put this together. This is also a drawing that I collected. One of the methods that I used was the drawings method that I asked children as young as 3 to draw how they imagine the United States to be or how they imagine Mexico to be. And this one, she drew, you can take a guess what you think this is. For those of you, maybe you can see Times Square right here. So it's interesting that she herself had never been to New York. And yes, again, I'm Brazilian. I grew up watching US movies, we see things, but it's also, I think, to just assume that it's a movie or an entertainment thing is to take away the agency of children who are actively trying to inhabit the world that the rest of their families are, right? This is another drawing. This one was interesting because it was about the border, right? It was about the bridge and having the police and highways and hotels and buildings, but also having the rain, right? Which are all kind of testimonials that they hear from folks who either try to cross or didn't succeed at crossing. So kind of all of these worlds become part of how children assemble their transnational identity, even if they themselves don't live in the US, right? So this is, a slide for you to have an idea about how I ran some of these workshops, right? So I would be in a plaza and I would have a lot of paper and pencils and glitter and paint, right? And then I would spend hours with kids in these settings, and some of them would have parents who lived in the United States. Some of them didn't have parents who lived in the United States, but knew somebody, right? So that was also part of me trying to get to that multi-level of engagement, right? So not just focusing on the families, but what are some of the broader trends in family separation that are important for us to keep in mind? And they all asked me to, whenever I talked about making presentations about this, they, most of the children I became close with asked me to please make sure that they're featured in, some of these. And I think it's one way to honor the ethics that we have to think through having, when we think about reciprocity and all the other pieces that make an ethnography possible, that it shouldn't be extractive, but there's always a power struggle, right? So it's something that to be aware of. So this is one drawing. So you can see here, she's on my top left. I don't know where she is in yours, but this is her first drawing, Gladys. And she drew herself as the child, as the baby being held by her mother, right? And she was 12 at the time, but she still chose to draw herself as the baby that is being held by her mother, because that's when the rupture, that's when her mother leaving, when that happened. All the other siblings are younger than her, but she drew them older also because of, her relationship with who is here and who is there. And you can see some of my notes, right, that I did on the drawing as she's telling me the stories. But I think it's important to think through this idea of suspended memory, right, where children are very much conscious about when these ruptures or these changes happened, and they are actively trying to make sense of that. And as researchers, how do we open spaces for those moments, right, to be told to us and for us to listen closely, as opposed to just live in our adult regulated world, right, and not think through in the way that they're thinking. And then this is another example that I thought it was really interesting, which is the role of video games for some of the children the siblings who were separated, right? So in this case, there was, one boy playing with his older sibling in Mexico. So he was in the South Bronx. His sibling was in Morelos in Mexico, and they played Call of Duty across borders together. For those of you who don't know Call of Duty, I'm not a fan, but for me, it's too violent. But for those of you familiar, folks, will put headphones, and if you're playing a team, you're able to tell the other teammate, be careful, there's somebody coming, or duck, or there's this, or there's a lot of interaction that can happen. And they did that without having ever known each other. So the perception from the boy here in New York was that his sibling was much older than him. And I have a passage that he says, my sibling in Mexico, he's 27, when in fact he was 15, or, just a few years older than him. But kind of these constructions of family and being away, and what does that mean, right? So this is where I'll, finish on this particular project, and I'll show you kind of moving forward what this particular research has helped me think through as I moved into different research projects. And, as much as this was definitely, my heart was in this, and I always tell my own advisees that when you choose a topic for you to do your dissertation, try to love it as much as you can, because you will be with it for a while. And it's important to have that motivation, right? So these are families that I'm still in touch with, that I still, to choose the picture for the cover of the book, it was a big production, because lots of folks in the research wanted their picture, right, to be in one way or another. So to be represented and to feel like they were there in the book. And even though I haven't been able to translate the book into Spanish, I have been able to talk about the book in Spanish with the families and translate smaller chapters or articles in order for them to read and to get the full experience. But I'll tell you this, that most of them will say that there's somebody else in the book, which I think it's interesting. So something else, to think about moving forward. So as I moved into kind of thinking about what is motherhood across borders, what did it teach me about, understanding how families stay organized and connected across borders, and how education is such a pulling force for, for things to move forward. And I moved, I finished my work in New York. And then after I graduated, I moved to Boston, where I am right now. And then here in Boston, I started working with school districts and elementary schools and teachers and classrooms, as opposed to what I did in the past, which I started with the immigrant mothers and the children in New York City. And then I traveled to Mexico to meet them, right? So two different strategies here that can yield different results in terms of where your starting point is, because I was always the families first, right? So if I went to school, when I went to school and I participated in parent teacher conferences, I was there for the families, for the mothers, for the children. And then in this newer project, I started from a district, working with a district that was receiving a lot of migrant children, right? So in this particular one is looping back to Brazilian immigrant children and families, and then their transnational experiences of education and belonging in the United States, and really looking at how a particular newly established language program, what does that do for families, right? Because one of the things that I saw in Motherhood Across Borders was that there was a lack of language practices in schools that ended up excluding families from participation. So then my question was, what happens if you have a dual language program, or, a language program? Would that make a difference in terms of how immigrant parents want to be a part of that school, right? So in the same way, I kept with the ethnography, focusing on children. And you can see here, I started working with narratives, because these kids were first, second grade. So they were trying to write about their experiences in Brazil, their experiences of migrating into the US, right? And then some of the findings here that I think it's really interesting to think about is that in the same way that I got on Motherhood Across Borders, that children were very much actively constructing their political worlds, it's very much what I've been seeing in the schools here, that children as young as 5 are talking about, green cards and being undocumented and crossing the border and Donald Trump and policies, right? And if we don't listen to them closely, we're missing out an entire world of things that we should be doing better, right, for children. So what this is, I'm not going to read this, but this is just, an excerpt from my newer project, which is this conversation between Kalebi and I, and Kalebi is 6. And he, you can see that he's talking about he calls it the green letter, which is the green card. And he's talking about who has money for lawyers, right? And who gets to do things, and who gets to travel, who gets to exist across borders. So these are things that are so present in everyday lives of children in the classroom. And I've been working with teachers for them to understand how to leverage that in curriculum, right? How to think through those lenses also when they're teaching, and how to make the world, the transnational worlds that these kids inhabit, part of their everyday worlds, for that not to be two different things, right? And then finally, because I want to leave time for questions, and sorry if I'm going on and on and on here, not stop talking, but the other current project that I'm working with, which was also financed and funded by the National Academy of Education with the Spencer Foundation, is what I'm calling the Immigrant Children's Education Experiences and Family Sacrifices in a Double Disaster, which basically means that when I started this research project, it was because of the 2018-2019 zero tolerance policy that separated families at the border, right? This policy was nothing new to what the United States has, done with children and families for a very long time. If it's, Black children, Indigenous children, it's undermining families is a strategy of deterrence, right? Is a strategy of trying to destabilize families that and populations that folks in power don't think that should be, coming into what they call their country. So in 2018, then you have the DOJ separating families, right? And kind of saying that the adults are going to be prosecuted as criminals, but then the children have to be handed over to Health and Human Services, right? As basically they become, the government become their guardians. So based on that, I started to think about, okay, I want to understand how families who have been recently reunified in Massachusetts, where I am, how are they navigating schooling? Because the first place that children go is the school, right? So, and that's where they are for 6 to 8 hours a day. So while we need to think about all of the other pieces on mental health and trauma, and we need to think about those actively, it's also really important to think about what is the role of, in many ways, teachers who become first responders, right? Of these emergencies and these things that are happening. So while I was doing that, what happened is that COVID hit. And then I could no longer be in schools. And then the families that I had been working with, I kept doing my work online, and I do a lot of FaceTime and WhatsApp. And I can talk to you about how to pivot qualitative research into online methods, which twisted my brain, but we're here. And a lot of the parents, the original title of this research was Now We're Here, because that was the first words that came out of, mothers and fathers' mouths when they were saying, listen, we went through all of this, but now we're here and we need to make it work for our children, right? And that is so rooted in educational opportunities and schooling. However, once you have to homeschool or Zoom school or Google Meet school or fully remote or hybrid and all of these new modules, right, of learning, that you kind of see that the parents now have a different role into what they imagined education would be like, right? So they started to kind of question the notions of sacrifice, which is you go through reunification and you think there's so much hope moving forward, but then care and sacrifice need to be there as center, to kind of explain the treacherous journey. And also the role of education becomes re-examined in terms of some of the parents felt that they were very much a part of the learning experience because they had a window into what their kids were learning. But at the same time, for some of them, it became very apparent that they, again, didn't feel included or in the teaching methods or in the ways that curriculum was being developed. So that also became part of how I started thinking about this. So I will stop here because I promised 35 minutes and I think I delivered. So I'm happy to take questions across projects or, for one project or however you want to do this. I know that it was a lot, to kind of pack into one presentation, but I just wanted to show you how it can evolve, like some thinkings and some concepts can kind of evolve with time. And what does that mean for our research agenda? So thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating, and we're really excited to have a conversation here now. So you have a couple questions in the chat, and others, if you'd like to post a question in the chat or maybe raise your hands, and we'll call on you until we go. So I don't know, Gabrielle, if you can see the first question from Ellie. She has two questions for you.
Yes. And Ellie, I don't know, do you want to ask the question, Ellie? Maybe you can jump in and.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, so you don't have to answer all of them. And I'm keeping like a running list of questions. So I guess I'm going to skip to my second question. My first question was kind of methodological, and maybe if there's time we can come back to it. But I'm curious, you started by talking about how you try to not just be speaking into the academic abyss, but actually bridge academia with practice and activism. And I was wondering, if you could talk more about how you do that, and if that's happening around particularly the project with separated families. I'd love to hear more about that. And then possibly connected, I'm wondering like how you personally are able to continue doing this and like stay positive, and if you're able to feel hopeful at all in the work that you're doing, which is really, touches on really difficult and emotional topics.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for these questions. I think that the first one, in terms of bridging, I think that I think in one of my recent projects with a particular district here in Massachusetts, I think that for me it has been the biggest learning experience, because I try to do a lot of data sharing with parents and with teachers and with leadership, that are doing that work. And I think that for me, I didn't do that in my first project with the families. I was working with organizations, grassroots organizations, and now it feels that there's this responsibility to also be able to engage with multiple stakeholders. So I think that that is a really great learning process if you're working with schools, that you're not just thinking about, I'm interested in teachers, or I'm interested in students as learners, or I'm interested in the leadership, that you can think about in a multi-level way and make space for that data to be shared, and force yourself to work on slides that make sense, not just for your colleagues, but for parents who have kids that go to that school, that need that information arguably way more than your colleague, right? So I think it's something to think about in terms of it's a training piece that you have to force yourself. You should also look for mentors and folks who do that well, and have them also, train you and practice with them. But I also think it's something that for me it evolved with being sure that it was reciprocal, that when I ask folks to fill out a survey, that I give back in terms of what I found, right? That it's not that other abyss. So I think that for me, that really, when the light bulb, has gone. And now with the separated families, I work with multiple organizations that I also offer to do background writing if they have asylum seekers that need, kind of, because I'm technically an expert on something, so I can provide, an expert witness type of writing, or I can participate. I can go into a parent-teacher conference and advocate for a child, or I can call a doctor, or I can do all these things that I'm much more comfortable doing now than I was when I first started doing research. But I think that comes with time. And you got to be able to deliver on your promises, right? In terms of, not to sound like a politician, but kind of this idea that if you can't do some of these things, then don't tell participants that you will be able to, because I think that's a crucial part, to be able to do that. And then on the second thing, I think this also, to think about, I never said that I was positive. I'm kidding. I try to be positive, and I think that between my first project and my first project, which became the book, I had my first child in the end of that project. That's when I defended my dissertation, when my first child was 7 months old. And I think that, it's really different doing motherhood work post experiencing that. Like, I went to hospitals with mothers before I had a baby, and I was there, watching them go through the pains and delivery, and being nervous about not speaking the language and all of it. And I had absolutely no idea. And that puts you in an amazing position, which is a full learner position. But at the same time, you've got to acknowledge your bias, and you got to acknowledge who you are and embrace that, and not hide away from it. You are who you are. You inhabit the body that you inhabit, right? And people are going to make assumptions about who you are. And I think it's trying to do that. But to answer your question, I think that this project with the district here in Massachusetts, for me, was a very positive experience. And I think it kind of lifted my spirits a little bit, in terms of to see so many people dedicated to include folks, to make sure that families were able to participate, that, families felt welcome in a school. I was so moved by that it gave me hope. And then it threw me back into the separated families, which is like, so I think you got to choose also projects that can keep you going as opposed to boggle you down. But I don't know if that completely answers your question, but that's how I try to think about it.
That does. Thank you.
You have 3 and probably more questions coming in the chat. So I'll just read out first. We have Turia, Nisha, and Jessica. So Turia's question is, how would you identify or define your research positionality, and how did you arrive there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's one book review on Anthropology and Education Quarterly, and I love that review. And one of the points they bring in is that they wish that I had talked more about my positionality in the book. And I think it's a very well taken point, and I think part of me has this thing with positionality statements that I feel like sometimes they detract from what it's supposed to be about. And sometimes I see pages and pages of people talking about themselves, and I'm, I don't want to say that I'm judgy, but I'm kind of like, okay, moving on. I want to know about this other stuff. So that was like my chip on my shoulder, to be fully honest, to kind of make that small. But I also think that I thought about passages in the book that gave the reader a sense of who I was, right? So there's a passage in the book that I have with one of the participants, and I'm sorry, I'm not calling anybody by their names because I have a very hard time transitioning from the real name to the pseudonym. So I'm nervous that I'm going to make a mistake. So with one of the mothers, she says to me, we're different, you and I. And I say, how so? And she says, well, you are Blanquita, right? So you're a white woman. And it's different for us, what we want in our lives and what you think you want, and the way that you say that you want to travel and you want to do research and you want to do that. And it all sounds great, but the real life is not where you are, kind of thing. And I think it's, and I think it was, for me, that exchange really positioned me, and I thought it was like a real exchange, and I embraced that positionality that was given to me, and I thought she gave an excellent read of who I was. So I went with that. But in terms of my own positionality, I would say I consider myself an immigrant Brazilian woman living in the United States, but I'm a white woman, right? So it's like if I walk down the street, I'm white. Like, it's in Brazil, I'd be white, but in the US, I'm not, because I'm from Latin America, right? So it's kind of these complicated things that I think, again, you got to be okay with inhabiting that and knowing the limits and the challenges that comes with, and embrace it in the best way that you can. So I would say that that's my particular positionality, because I identify with being an immigrant very closely. I think that when I was doing my first research for the book, I was on a student visa. So in many ways that provided some sort of entry with participants, because I wasn't, now I'm a citizen, but I went through the different transitions of paperwork and bureaucracy with a lot of privilege and help and all of that. So it's not the same. I took, multiple trips to the border to do the crossing, to understand it, to interview people. But again, I always had papers to do so. So I think that that's kind of my relationship. I try to think about relationality as opposed to positionality, which is my relationship with participants as opposed to my position, my monologue about my position, which I just did. But yeah, so that's what I would say. I hope that answers a little bit.
I think that leads really nicely to Nisha's question, which is about then how did you navigate sampling and access to participants, considering the sensitive nature of your research?
So it comes with a lot of rejection. A lot of people don't want to talk to you. A lot of people don't want to answer surveys, right? A lot of people, and if they do, sometimes they don't want to tell the truth. And that's all fair, and people have the right to do that. So I think that I started really thinking about, I had multiple strategies to find participants for the book. But what really, really helped was when I had a good 3 or 4 women who I was really close with, and then they introduced me to 2 or 3 more. So that's, we call it snowball sampling, or RDS, the responsive directive something, I don't know, many names for the same thing of people introducing you to others. And I think that they also had to choose me, right? So it wasn't as much that I was there being like, okay, you're great. Yes, it was like, do you want to spend time with me? Maybe you don't, and that's okay. I get it. And a big mistake that I made in the very beginning was I did two things. One of the things was also that I went to Mexico and I met children there, and then I came to New York and I found the mothers in New York. And that was not a good strategy, because the mothers were like, why are you talking to my children before you talk to me? Right. And I would have done the same thing. So I think that was, for me, was an interesting thing to think about in terms of you've got to start with the mothers in New York City. You've got to, have that relationship be very strong to then be able to travel to Mexico and stay in people's homes and be welcome there, because there's that transition as well. Yes.
Nisha, did you want to follow up with anything? And I know, Toria, we went on to the next question before you got a chance to follow up as well.
She just said thank you in the chat.
Okay, great. Super. Jessica has a little bit longer question. I'm afraid I'm going to get it all confused. So maybe Jessica, do you mind asking your question directly? Assuming you have microphone access? Yeah.
Hi, Jessica. I can't hear you.
Me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. All right. So in the beginning, you talked about how mothers are often involved in educational matters for their children in Mexico, but then on the reverse side, right, once they're in the U.S. context, they face difficulty with their children in schools and here in the U.S. due to language, knowledge, things like that. So did you ever find that mothers talked about like either their individual agency in terms of like this contradiction, or talked about sort of these two things as related at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces, right? Like the very sacrifice in the name of education sometimes put them into a position that they felt that they didn't have the agency that they thought they could, right? Maybe if they were in their hometown knowing the school or something like that. So that was definitely a tension within that. I think that's why I thought it was interesting moving on to the project with the dual language, program, is that a lot of the parents have expressed gratitude towards having a language program. And I write about problematizing the idea of gratitude because it's also a whole different thing that we can talk about. But is this idea of feeling seen and recognized, and a language program goes a long way, right? For people to feel like honored and recognized, and then their agency can maybe be valued, in a different way. So I think that for the mothers, they definitely discuss that not only that they felt that their agency was being questioned or pushed, but they also felt a lot of guilt about the caregivers in Mexico being put into a position of having to do that work as well. So in many ways, moving that puzzle, right, that particular migration moved a lot of different relationships in schools and agency and all of that. And it was so heavily centered on these women. So they had to think through, what does it mean to care to multiple groups of children, right? What does it mean to be a good mother and participate in school things in the US and in Mexico? So sometimes doing the work in Mexico, the transnational participation helped their agency, their school agency in the United States. So that was also another particular interplay. Yes, I see. Does that help? Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, did I skip a question?
I don't think so. I was personally wondering, do you ever feel like the mothers should know what their pseudonym is in the book? That way they can confirm that like their story was told correctly, or has it never like really crossed your mind? Or do you ever show them like little pieces of the book before it was published?
I did show before it was published. And the pseudonyms, I think that was, some of them even said you can use my name, but I was very nervous because I'm a huge fan. I don't know if you've all read Enrique's Journey, Sonia Nazario. She's very famous, so I'm not famous like her. But, just planted this seed in me that if something were to happen, it would not have been worth it, right? At all. No book would have been worth it. So I think that for me, that was always kind of a hard, division of it's going to be a pseudonym because that's the best way that I can protect, folks in my view. But they, all of the women, they all saw the book before. They actually, what I've done actually is that they saw the notes also that I was taking, and they listened to the interviews. So I think that's way more important than the final product, because if they know what you know, they also know that you can interpret that in your own way because you're a human being, right? And I think that trust is actually a lot more important than, quote unquote, the veracity of, or, of what is being portrayed, because it's never going to be exactly what you think it is, right? If somebody were to write a story of me, right, I probably have a lot of questions about, really? You think that? No, there's another explanation for that. You just didn't catch it, right? And I think that in ethnography, that's the risk that we run, in terms of we are the tools of data collection, and it's through us that we do that. So you got to be okay with, having that relationship of trust with folks, that people will trust your analysis, even if it's not exactly what they think should be. It's different if you're getting facts wrong, right? If I said something like, the year you migrated was this, and this would happen to you in the trip, right? And she'd be like, that's actually not true. That's a problem. So that's some fact checking that needs to happen. But I think the analysis is something that is free range, so.
I think we have time for one last question, and I see Tajma has posted a question in the chat. Can you shed light on the process of transforming your dissertation into a book?
Yes, and sorry, I don't know if you can hear the lawnmower or something outside. Eventually I want to write something that it's called The Sounds of the Suburbs, because that's all I hear all day is leaf blowers, lawnmowers, But anyway, so I think that, and it's not the same for everybody. My advisor was very flexible from the beginning, and she let me write my dissertation in the form of a book. I never had to write a chapter in methodology. I never had to write chapters that didn't feel like I would use for the book, right? So the way that I wrote is that I had an appendix, which was the methodology, which made it into the book, which is like an 8-page explanation of what I did, right? And she also, it was okay for me to have literature in each chapter that illuminated what each chapter's data was bringing to life, as opposed to foregrounding a ton of literature that if the reader moved to chapter 2, be like, what was that literature again? I have to go back and, get your framework. So the introduction was the biggest challenge to write, because he had to have the hook, the thesis, the methods, the roadmap, and the framework, right? So that was a tough thing to do. And probably the piece that I had the biggest challenge to do. And my editor also, the first time she read it, she said, you got to stop thinking like a student and start thinking like an expert. So switch the order of things. Instead of showing that you crossed every T and dotted every I, because every piece of literature that has been published, start with your data and show what you know, and then situate it in what exists. So I think that those were the main things that I was able to do. So I was allowed to start with a flexible way, so I didn't have to spend too much time chopping chapters, rearranging, but then every chapter I still had to change my framework of trying to think, I know this, I can write a stronger conclusion, I can, hit it harder in terms of this is what I know. And it's a tough thing to find your voice like that, to be comfortable with saying that you know what you know. So I think that it's a process on that. And I was also, the last thing I'll say is that I was also allowed to write the interludes. And I had to fight for those, which are the few pages between every chapter of data that is not necessarily related to any chapter, that could be read as a standalone type thing. And the reviewers, when I submitted my manuscript, they were divided. They were like, oh, I don't know if that flows. And some of them, oh, I like it, but I went with it. And I think it was the right thing to do. But I think that that was, I was also allowed, and my committee trusted me with my decisions and supported me. So if you have a vision, try to tell the folks in your committee and get them on your side, because you have your vision and it's your work. So I think that's an important thing to have.
Well, thank you so much. It's exactly 1:01 Eastern time, so we timed that perfectly. I want to thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise, and thank everyone who took time out of their day or evening or night or whatever time it is for you to join us today. Please come back next month. We have November 17th and 18th, 2 colloquium speakers in honor of International Education Week. One talking about decolonizing comparative education as a field. Regina Cortina, we're really excited. I know, Gabrielle, you have acknowledged her in the book.
Yes.
It's a nice carry on. Then we're going to South Africa, where we're going to be hearing from Divya Bana about how gender, sexuality, and violence have integrated in very horrifying ways in the South African education context. And then we go to Cambodia in December, where we have a panel discussion from a team of researchers working across academia and development practice in education spaces, talking about the complexity of that. So we're very excited to have you all here, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. So we can stop the recording here. Eric, thanks.